Robert. He's been with us for quite a while now. How long have you been with us now, Robert?
A little over 4 years now.
4 years now. And what's great about Robert, he had some previous experience in the construction industry as a tradesman. He was already aerial lift operator certified, I believe forklift as well. So he has experience with equipment with wheels, which is what he specializes with ehsInc, as that slide will tell you. And he is our safety specialist. So he'll talk about some more, but he was recently certified as an OSHA or authorized OSHA outreach trainer for construction, which is big news. Now he's authorized to teach the OSHA 10 and OSHA 30 hour for construction. So if you guys need training on that, give us a shot and we'll go ahead and help you out with that.
Good morning, guys. So this is what we have today on our agenda. We've got temporary traffic control and its requirements. What I do have to mention is that this presentation is based mainly on the CAMUTCD. There are some similarities between the MUTCD and California's manual, but again, this one is mainly focused on California, guys. So we'll talk about temporary traffic control requirements. We'll talk about requirements for flagging. And then, of course, at the very end, we'll have a quick question and answer session if you guys have any good questions for me. Now, as I mentioned, this, I guess you mentioned it's kind of like a tailgate. This training it's based on the state's requirements, not necessarily requirements. They're kind of guidelines more than anything. So this is going to be more work area specific because I've been to different cities where they require things like a traffic control plan. Doesn't matter how long you're going to be doing the work or when you're exposed to traffic. And then I've been to cities that never have a traffic control plan other than long-term operations. So again, before you conduct any temporary traffic control and flagging operation, refer to the most current federal, state, and municipal regulations that apply to your specific job and industry, because a lot of it is not only what speed you're working at, but it's also how long you're going to be out there. A lot of different things affect how you should be setting up. So again, this training, the majority of the training is based on that state-specific California manual, the California Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. This is temporary traffic control. So specifically, we're going to be talking about Chapter 6 within the CAMUTCD. Now, the issue with traffic control and why at times it seems like it's ineffective with the public is that there's a big disconnect between the people who are actually doing the work and the people who are driving through these work sites. Now, usually what the public sees is a guy in an orange shirt working alongside the roadway, and let's say if they're telling them to stop, they think, why is this construction worker telling me what to do on that roadway? What gives him the authority to let me know what to do? Well, the way that the law works, guys, is that whoever's being an obstruction on the roadway, whoever's doing the work on the roadway, has to safely guide people through the affected area, right? So they have the authority in that affected area. And what gives them the authority is California Vehicle Code 21367. 21367 says it is unlawful to disobey the instruction of a person directing traffic, which, I mean, if you've ever been a flagger, you understand that a flagger is a person who's directing traffic. And if you speak to the guys actually doing the flagging, they constantly get people who will disobey their instruction and go around a stop sign, or that'll just speed through the work zone entirely. So again, that is breaking the law, right? C says it is unlawful to fail to comply with the direction of warning signs, lights, or other control devices provided, which means, and this happens again constantly where people are driving in through these work zones. They may not be understanding the signs, or they may be doing it out of spite or something, right? They may just be having a bad day. But again, whenever they're not complying with your direction, the direction of your signs or arrow boards or whatever you're using to guide traffic, they are breaking the law. Now, I understand that it's the construction worker thing to be tough and just have to deal with it, and it's not a big deal. But there are a lot of people who are losing their lives because these things are occurring and no one's doing anything about them, right? A lot of people don't understand that it's part of the flagger's responsibilities to actually report these issues that are going on. And if they don't have time to report them to the law enforcement, they're actually supposed to report it to their supervisors, and the supervisors are supposed to take care of it. The issue with that is the workers often tell me, well, we want to avoid that, because how do we prove it? It's more of a he said, she said kind of thing. And how do we know if someone is, how do we prove that that individual is the one that blew past us, blew past our stop sign? Well, again, I mean, there's a lot of devices you guys can purchase and set up at different locations. You guys obviously know that it's not feasible to have a CHP or a highway patrol officer at every one of the traffic control locations for any individual city. So what you guys can do to kind of have documentation and proof of the individuals who are breaking the law is maybe set up a GoPro at different ends of the work site, so people, and you guys know how it is, when the CHP officer, or they understand that they're being watched, people tend to be on their best behavior when they know that they'll get caught and get in trouble. All right, but unless we're reporting these things, people are going to continue to get away with them. Again, I mentioned that there's a disconnect between people who are working in the roadways and people who are driving through these sections. They don't understand that these laws exist. So we have to make them aware. And unfortunately, usually people have to report them, and it's not until they get fines and jail time or their car is towed away that they'll stop doing these things. And word of mouth works pretty well to keep this from happening. So report anything that you guys feel is necessary to. So again, these individuals may be giving you the one finger salute. That's not enough to report. It's only when they're endangering your work crew, your life, or other individuals on the roadway as well. All right. Temporary traffic control. Now, I mentioned the people who are working on the roadways are in charge of safely guiding people through their work site. So your work site isn't always going to be the roadway. It's also going to be sidewalks that you guys are encroaching on. So what the MUTCD says and the CAMUTCD say is the needs and control of all road users. And this, of course, isn't just talking about the person driving the car. It's also bicyclists that may be going through the area. If you're encroaching on a sidewalk, it includes people walking by, people in a wheelchair. It includes people who are blind. So everybody's needs have to be met through your work zone, right? The way it works is you have to give them safe passage through your site or no access to your site, right? If there's no way you can safely guide them through, you can't allow them to get to your work site, all right? So again, the needs and control of all road users, including persons with disabilities in accordance with the ADA through a TTC zone, shall be an essential part of highway construction, utility work, maintenance operations, and management of traffic incidents. Now, for those of you who have experience working in the roadway, you should know and understand that not every setup is going to be the same. All right, there's a lot of things that go into how you should be setting up. Now, let's just say all you guys ever did was a right lane closed, right? You were working on the right lane, you would close the right lane. Well, even if that's all you did, those right lane closed are going to look different or be set up differently in different work areas, right? Because it's different to set up in an area where you're going through a straightaway than if you're setting up around a curve, a blind curve. It's different to set up at your work location at 25 miles an hour than it is at 55 miles an hour. So again, there's a lot of things that go into it. How long you're going to be out there goes into it as well. The volume of traffic, how many and what types of traffic you're dealing with. So again, not every one of your setups should be set up the same way, even if you're trying to accomplish similar things. Now, what's supposed to be done out there, and a lot of cities do this, but a lot of cities or a lot of workers will tell me that it's ineffective, is you're supposed to be giving the road users almost like an advance notice. Hey, from this day to this day, we're going to be closing off this major street. We're going to take out multiple lanes, and this is what we're doing out here. That should be done for all arterial work if you're taking out multiple lanes, or just for a long period of time. You're supposed to give them advance notice and let them know what type of work you're doing, how it's going to affect them, and if you can, set up alternative routes, which means you set up message boards and different cone patterns to guide them around the site, not go through that site. By doing this, you guys will have to deal with less of the public, and dealing with the public isn't fun if you've ever dealt with the public regularly, right? So you accomplish this by setting out message boards in advance. I often get the complaint though from people in my classes, well, we set these message boards up, but if you actually go and see where these guys are setting them up, they'll complain that no one's actually reading them. But you go out there and look, and they have them set up, and the message board is obstructed by another sign, or the message board is obstructed by a tree. Again, where you're placing these message boards matters. They have to be visible. Yeah, no one's reading them if they aren't actually able to read them, right? Now, this is all going to depend on where you're working. I've done classes for contractors that work at Camp Pendleton. I've done classes for a lot of different cities. Some cities require a plan for every operation. Doesn't matter if it's a mobile operation or if it's going to be, full day or whatever the time frame may be. But the whole deal is if you're working on with something complex, a plan of some kind, everybody who's on that site, not just the supervisor, is supposed to be aware of what the plan says and how it's supposed to be set up before you guys are out there actually throwing out the cones and doing the work, right? That way, supervisor, once he leaves the job, whoever is at that point in charge of that project or still working at that project, something, gets out of place, they understand how to fix it, right? Everybody's got to be on the same page before the site is occupied. Now, you guys have to make sure that the guys that are going out there to do the work are trained, that they understand what good traffic control is and what bad traffic control is. And you guys have all seen both in your time driving any city streets, right? You have to make sure that the right people are on these roadways, right? Because how it works, guys, is if an accident happens, it's not just the guys who touch the cones that get into trouble. It's everybody who was involved in that project that will get into that legal trouble. So you want the right people in the right positions. Make sure that they understand what they're doing and make sure that they're complying at least with what the local regulatory agencies say. Remember that if something happens, everybody involved on that project, whether they touch the cones or not, is going to be held accountable. Remember that the whole purpose of the traffic control, guys, is the safety first and foremost. You have to be safe. You, by setting up something that's effective, keeps you safe from the public, and the public safe from whatever obstructions or whatever hazards you're creating on the roadway. And again, responsible. Remember, guys, doesn't matter what your role was. Doesn't matter if all you did was just ensure that these guys were going to show up to the job. You're involved in the project. You may be held liable and responsible as well. As the work progresses, TTC, temporary traffic control, or working conditions should be modified in order to provide reasonably safe and effective road user movement and to provide worker safety. So basically what that means is as conditions change, and condition doesn't necessarily mean with traffic only, this could be your work conditions as well. It's different to work daytime and nighttime, right? So if you're ever doing a project at night, one of those changes would be lighting requirements. It's different here. We're dealing with hot weather in California. Recently came back from San Francisco. It's like a 20-degree temperature difference. So I'm still trying to kind of acclimate again. But yeah, it's different to work in 70-degree weather than it is to work in 90-degree weather, right? So again, the worker safety is what is going to be most important there. And obviously, workers remain safe if you're giving the public a safe way to get around the site and simple instructions, right? You want to provide them with as much information as possible. The easier it is to understand, the better and more effective traffic's going to flow.
You can't even see that sign. It's crazy.
And you guys notice at the flagger there, because you put the paddle on a cone.
I didn't even see him.
This guy's sitting in the shade. If there's a flagger required at your job site, guys, you can't just set your paddle on a cone. You got to have someone step in for them for those breaks, and that person has to be qualified. Something that normally happens is that usually the flagger on projects is the guy that just got hired, and you don't know what else to have them do. And if he's not trained and he causes an accident, he's not the only one that's getting in trouble. So you want to make sure that the people who are controlling traffic know how to do it and do it safely. Now, again, all this information isn't stuff that EHS says. This isn't stuff that I say. This is all stuff that's directly from the CAMUTCD, right? And this particular slide says all TTC devices shall be removed as soon as practical when they're no longer needed. So if you've ever driven through construction sites, sometimes think of your regular commutes around your cities, local cities, right? Sometimes you'll find that people leave their equipment out, like the traffic control signs and the cones, and they'll leave lanes closed. But when you drive past the site, you don't see any hazardous equipment. So like say no heavy equipment like a skid steer. Yeah, if they leave a skid steer on the roadway, then yeah, you definitely want to close off the lane. Or if they leave an open trench or something like that, right? But there are places where they leave all their cones, lanes closed, signs out, but there's no work going on and no hazards that are left over at the site. If that's the case, if things don't need to be there, they have to be removed. They have to be removed according to the CAMUTCD. So it says when work is suspended for short periods of time, TTC devices that are no longer appropriate shall be removed or covered. Because how it works, guys, is people get used to seeing these signs up and these lanes closed, and after a while they become ineffective. They'll see that, you know, every time they drive past the site, there's no work going on. So guess what? One day they're going to see traffic pile up and they're going to assume that there's no work going on. So they'll decide to cut through that lane that's been closed and they've driven past 100 times. And this time they're going to assume the same thing, no work going on. And guess what? What if this time there's actually people working at that site? Now, someone may be struck by a vehicle and it all could have been prevented, right? We will have to keep traffic control effective and use it for its purpose. Another note on those message boards, and I know that was a few slides back, those message boards are supposed to be used to guide traffic messages only. I've driven past a few cities in the past where they're advertising stuff on these message boards. Oh, use these devices for their intended purpose. Because again, if you're using them for other than traffic control, now they're gonna avoid looking at them because they're gonna think you're selling them stuff, or say, hey, I've seen this is businesses. I've seen businesses have like the orange advanced warning signs saying something like taco stand ahead. Oh, so again, that lessens the effectiveness of the actual traffic control signs out there. So if you guys ever see that advertisements with, you know, designs of traffic control, if you're that local agency, I would have those taken down immediately. Now, traffic control planning, again, has to be completed prior to occupying the TTC zone. So everybody, I mean, most of the work that's being done is, you know, these sites are being visited by these workers maybe multiple times a year. So what should be done is they plan and discuss at the morning meeting and say, hey, this is how the last time we were out here went. These were the issues we had. This is what we needed. This is what we should have each and every time we go out here, right? So the time to discuss these things is while you're still at the yard and not when you're already doing the work. That way you make sure you have everything that you need before you go out there. And again, written documentation is strongly recommended. What I always, I let people know, this is just, you know, what I kind of advise people to do, is that once they set it up according to what they've planned or what they thought was best, I always ask that they test these sites, drive through them, right? If you can safely get through, then the public has a chance, right? But if you who set it up are having difficulty driving through the site, if you who set it up, who should understand it best, have difficulties getting around that site, that means the public has no shot, right? We have to treat the public as if they know nothing at all, because in some cases, the public knows nothing at all, right? So I advise that you guys test these after you set them up. And if they work, I usually tell people to take pictures, right? Because when an accident happens, the cones aren't going to be in the same place. The signs may not be in the same place. Your vehicles may not be in the same place. So how do you prove that you did everything the right way? Document everything. Now we're actually getting into those zones. Now every zone has its purpose. Advanced warning area, there's a few things that you're letting the public know before they get to the area where you're affecting them. Advanced warning area notifies the public, right? You're giving them the information, what to expect, where you guys are working, that you guys are actually working in the roadway. That way you can give them the information and they can make the best decision, right? Make it as simple as possible. Transition area. This is where we're physically moving or forcing people to move from their path of travel to another path of travel where we want them to go. Activity area contains several components. Buffer spaces, the workspace where the work is actually taking place, traffic space, the area or the lanes that you leave open for traffic to travel around your work site, and then termination area. Termination meaning the end, right? You're letting them know, hey, beyond this point, all things that we affected are now back to normal. So if you guys are dropping speed limits, you know, beyond this point, it means everything goes back to the posted speed. If you're taking out lanes, you're letting them know beyond the termination area, all lanes go back to their normal placement, normal width, and again, open for use. Now, so again, here are the sites, and here's a little diagram to help you understand these things. We've got advanced warning area. In the advanced warning area, on this particular example, we're taking out the right lane. So the signs that make sense to have would be a road work ahead, because we have guys working in the roadway. We have to let them know exactly where the guys are and what lane we're taking out, right? So it would be right lane closed ahead. And then that symbol there means merge left, right? So if we take out the right lane, we have to have them merge left. Give them as much information as possible, right? Make it as easy to understand as possible. Guide them as, you know, as best, well, as best. I'm here speaking kind of incorrectly, but you guys get my point, right? Guide them, give them as much information as you can so they can make the best decision, right? Now, shoulder taper here is included in the advanced warning area, and I'll tell you guys why. Most tapers are in the transition area, but if you look at the CAMUTCD, it says the transition area moves traffic out of its normal path. Shoulder is not a normal path of travel. Shoulder is there for emergencies, right? So if you're closing off the shoulder, it would be considered part of the advanced warning area, not the transition area. So the transition area begins whenever we're, you know, moving people out of normal path of travel. So let's say this was a bike lane instead of a shoulder. Well, if we're closing off a bike lane is someone's path of travel. So that would signal the transition area. Now, activity areas where the work takes place. Activity area is the busiest part of the setup, right? In the activity area, we've got the buffer spaces, longitudinal and lateral. And again, a lot of these things are going to be mentioned in the CAMUTCD as optional, but that's according to the state. Your local policies may say otherwise and require these longitudinal and lateral buffer spaces. Longitudinal's, you know, wide open area that begins at the end of the taper and continues to the beginning of your designated work area. So your work area is wherever you start placing vehicles, material, people, right? That's your workspace. It's not just where you guys are actually affecting, where you guys are digging. It's the entire place where you're taking up space that involves equipment, not there to delineate or move people or traffic. All right. So any equipment, any material, any people, any work vehicles, where you're placing them, that's your workspace. Traffic space allows traffic to pass through the activity area. Right, so that's the open lanes. If you leave them any open lanes, that's their way of getting around your work site. That's the traffic space. And then the last area, we got the termination area. Termination area lets traffic resume normal operation. So basically everything that you affected goes back to normal beyond that point, right? I mentioned keeping everything as simple as possible, right? Give them the easiest way of interpreting when your sites end. Downstream tapers, again, would be one of those things that's considered optional according to the CAMUTCD. But if it takes setting up 4 cones to let them know, hey, now it's safe to merge back into that lane, it's easy to set up 4 cones, guys. So do it so people understand, hey, from this point on, it's okay to merge back into that lane. And roadwork signs, normally you don't find them for the smaller or shorter operations. You'll find them for the ones that are staying in place longer than 3 days. But again, this is going to be specific for your work areas. Camp Pendleton requires these signs be placed for every traffic control operation. Now, tapers, we have them in a particular order here. Those first 3 tapers, merging, shifting, and shoulder, are the ones that are going to be based on speed, right? So the greater the speed, that also means that the longer the required length for these tapers is. Those next 2 tapers, downstream and 1-lane 2-way traffic taper, basically it's a 1-lane closure for 2-way, where you're leading traffic in 2 directions. It's flagger taper, right? Those 2 tapers, downstream and flagger, those are 50 to 100 to merge them back into traffic and 50 to 100 to merge them back into their normal position. So those are 2 special tapers. Regardless of speed, they're going to be 50 to 100. Merging, shifting, and shoulder, they have their certain lengths based on speed. Merging taper is that top taper you see there. It's coming downward. It's where you're taking out a full lane, forcing them to merge into a lane that's traveling in the same direction. So here we've got 2 lanes flowing down on the diagram, or south, depending on what verbiage you want to use there. And you're cutting out 1 lane and you're moving them over into the lane that's traveling in the same direction. All right, so you're taking a full lane, forcing them to merge over. Merging taper. Shifting taper is, I guess you could say, a little bit more complicated. It comes with more requirements, I would say. Shifting taper is when you're shifting lanes. You're not closing them over. You're encroaching on a lane, but you're just moving them or nudging those lanes over, placing the lanes in a different spot. Shifting taper requirements. Now, this isn't on here, so if you guys are listening, jot it down. If the street is a straightaway before you affect it, the minimal lane widths after you've encroached on the lane, you've got to maintain 10 feet of open lane space for them to be allowed to use a shifting taper. So let's say we've got a 12-foot lane, you're encroaching 2 feet, you set the cones out 2 feet into the lanes, that means you still got 10 feet of lane space. If you're able to maintain those 10 feet on a straightaway, you're good, right? If you can't maintain those 10 feet of separation in lane width, then you have to take that first lane in and use a merging taper instead. So it's 10 feet for straightaways. If you're setting up on a curve, this means that it's a curve before you've done anything to that street. You have to maintain 12-foot lane widths, okay? So you have to maintain 12-foot lane space in each lane that you're affecting and shifting them over. So shifting taper, again, is when you're trying to keep all lanes open, you're just moving the placement of those lanes so you can get your work done. They're working, or the traffic's moving around you guys. Shoulder taper is pretty simple to understand. You're closing out the shoulder, okay? And those are shorter tapers because those are, again, not intended, shoulders are not intended to be driven through. I'm sure at some point you guys have seen someone drive through a shoulder, but it's not for that purpose. Downstream taper, 50 to 100. Downstream taper is the taper that signals the end of the work zone. So you're saying, hey, I know we shifted these lanes over this way. Now we're putting them back into their normal position. If you closed out a lane, this taper will also say, beyond this point, we're opening this lane back open for use. So again, this just returns things to the normal placement, normal width, normal position, and again, opens up those closed up lanes. Flagger taper is a little bit harder to explain, and it involves 2 opposite flowing lanes. It's kind of like using a merging taper, except you're merging these guys into, or people into, oncoming traffic, right? So you can't just say, hey, go into that oncoming traffic lane and just avoid the headlights. What you're supposed to do is control traffic on both ends of the work site. You allow one side to go and you hold up traffic on the other side, and then those flaggers work hand in hand to keep traffic moving safely. Now, tapers and buffer spaces. Again, a lot of these things are going to be based on formulas in the CAMUTCD. If you notice, the merging taper has an L next to it. That's because the formulas in the CAMUTCD that help you figure out how long these tapers are required to be, that's your base formula. So first you have to figure out what L is, the merging taper length. There's a formula for high speed and a formula for low speed. Once you figured out what merging taper length is, if you decide to use a shifting taper, you just know, hey, the shifting taper has to be half the length of the merging taper. So whatever you get for merging taper, all you do is divide by 2, and it gives you your legal shifting taper length, what's required for a shifting taper at that speed. And then if you're just closing off the shoulder, once again, you figure out what merging taper does, or whatever merging taper length is, and then you divide by 3, and it gives you the required shoulder taper length. All right, but again, this is a lot. I know it's a lot, and it's a lot to cover in an hour. So I'm just trying to do my best, guys, to get you caught up on what you need to know. And again, these classes, there's only so much you can cover in an hour. These classes normally for a full day class, an initial class, with us, it'd be an 8-hour session, and sometimes even in 8 hours, there's a lot that kind of can slip through the cracks, guys. So we try to prepare everybody prepare them for what they're likely to expect on the roadway. But again, The issue with the roadways is that they're unpredictable. You can only control what you're doing. You can't control what people on the roadway are doing each and every time that they're going through your site. Now, the next slide over, we're talking about pedestrian safety. As I mentioned, you're not always going to be working right in the roadway. You may be encroaching on a sidewalk. Now, if you're guiding traffic on sidewalks and you're using cones, so you're providing a path for them or you're closing off access to sidewalks, if using cones for pedestrian movement, there can be no gaps between bases. It must be continuous. So what this standard literally says is, hey, if you're using cones to close off a sidewalk or provide a path for pedestrians, all of the cones have to be butted together end to end. And some people think that this is written by the state to kind of keep people from climbing over the cones and walking through the area. The honest truth is, if you have your cones set up butted together end to end, you're still going to have the people who are able to see that are, going to just go through anyway. But what the state's focused on here is the people who cannot see. Now, if they're relying on a long cane to guide them through your site or around certain obstacles, if there's a gap between your cones, they may not know that the cones are there and they'll wander into your site, which again, you can do nothing about. So again, the state wants whatever you're using to close off access or to provide paths for the pedestrians, they have to be touching, butted together end to end, and it's got to be continuous. Anything that you're using to direct traffic, delineate traffic would be a better term here, has to be crashworthy. Crashworthy just means when they're struck by vehicles, doesn't cause harm to people walking the areas nearby, people working nearby, and causes minimum threat to person who's driving the vehicle. So this thing that you're crashing into should not fly through the windshield and harm you that's driving. Because now, let's say it does strike the driver. Now that driver may be incapacitated and he may not have control of that vehicle, right? So whatever we're using has to be crash worthy, right? None of those things should happen when they are struck by a vehicle. Now, here's one to give you guys a little bit different perspective. A lot of cities will contract companies to do work, finish up certain projects. Now, if your contractors are leaving this behind, there should be someone keeping an eye on the contractors. Inspectors are supposed to be catching these things because these things shouldn't be left at the end of the day, or let's say the weekend, right? On Fridays or Thursdays, whenever your Friday is, it shouldn't be left this way. Because how it works, guys, and how the law works is if a contractor leaves something like this, it's not just the contractor that's going to get in trouble. The hiring party also has shared liability with them. Now, the issues here, obviously, you've got an open trench. If it's not coned off properly, there's no signs, warning signs, or anything like that. And there are people other than inspectors looking for these types of things. I'm sure you guys have seen daytime television commercials at one time or another. Those are tailored to people who may not be working, so we can call them a little bit more desperate, right? So they'll see these commercials with all the different lawyers and the easy to remember numbers, and they'll see the big settlements that are done, and they'll remember, oh, that's right, I saw that open trench. Now, if someone did fall into that open trench, how hard would it be to actually find a lawyer who's willing to represent that person? Not very hard. There's probably a bus bench across the street with the lawyer's face plastered all over it and numbers as well. All right, so again, inspectors catch these issues. Make sure that contractors are meeting the same standards that your own employees are supposed to meet. Anything that you're using and leaving out on the roadway, there's 5 basic requirements for these devices to be effective. So those requirements are, to be effective, a traffic control device should meet 5 basic requirements. It's got to be out there for a reason, right? It's got to fulfill a need. There's got to be a purpose for it to be out there. It must command attention. Now, signs, yes, people look at signs for the message, but what draws your attention in is the bright colors, right? Or the blinking lights or the waving flags. So your devices must command attention. Must convey a clear, simple meaning. So that means they should be easily understood. must command respect from road users and give adequate time for proper response. So what that last bullet point means is you got to place them in a way that you're giving them time to read them, understand them, and react to them. If you're placing them just before the work site, like 100 feet out may not be effective. Depending on the speed you want, the minimum you should have them out is 100. And again, these aren't things that I'm saying, it's things that the CAMUTCD says. And those are for speeds 25 or less, guys. The MUTCD says you should have those signs spaced out 100 feet from one another and 100 feet from whenever you're starting to affect traffic. That's 25 miles per hour or less. So you can imagine, the greater the speed, the more space and time you have to give them to read, understand, and react. And obviously, guys, that is more of a joke sign. It's not effective, right? It's not easy to understand. Signs, whenever possible, should be these international signs. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that, you go to Russia, you're going to find these exact signs. What they're trying to say is there's signs that can be easily understood, regardless of what language a person speaks. So as you can tell, these signs, what they have in common is there's no English on these signs. So what the CAMUTCD and the MUTCD say is that in order for signs to be most effective, you should be using the pictogram signs when there is a pictogram sign for it, right? So I understand that some things can't be communicated through a picture, and those, yes, of course, use the English signs. But whenever there is a sign that you can convey the same message with the picture, it's easier to understand the picture, and more people will understand it with the picture than the English, guys. And they say that there's certain areas where you should use these pictogram signs, like say tourist areas. Here, California, we've got Disneyland, we've got the beaches, we've got universities, we've got a lot of different places where you can kind of assume that people who are flying in and out of California, some of them do not read or speak English. We've got people who travel to LA for business, and they're coming in from China, Japan, a lot of different places. And yes, it's easy to know, and it's not an assumption at this point. You guys know that not everybody who even resides in California speaks English, or in the US for that matter, right? So make it easier, make it most effective, and whenever there's a picture sign, use the picture sign instead. Cones, okay, traffic cones. Now, most of the times when I get to this slide, the guys will tell me, yeah, well, all we use is those 28-inch cones. Again, all I'm letting you guys know is what the CAMUTCD says. Your local policies are going to be different than what the CAMUTCD says. Nowadays, if you drive through, majority of the cities, all you're going to find are the 28-inch cones. And that's good. You want cones that can be seen at a distance. And if you're leaving them out at night, yeah, they better be retroreflective, right? They have to be seen. Now, the guidelines say night or high speed being 45 miles per hour or more, low speed 40 or less. So, the guidelines say you can use the day or low speed cones, but again, I don't encourage it. You guys, it's better to use the cones that can be seen at a greater distance, can be seen by more people. And the reflective material also matters on these cones. And reflective material matters on your signs and your vests and everything else. The standards basically say for the reflective material, and then think about your guys' cone inventory and your signs and everything else. Your reflective material on your vests, signs, cones, whatever the equipment is, should be seen at night at a distance of 1,000 feet by someone driving with 20/20 vision and legal with their vehicle with legal high beam headlights. So that's when the reflective material to that distance, it should at least reflect back at that distance. If it's not, maybe it's time to replace the vest. Maybe it's time to replace the cone or the sign, right? You want these things to be seen at a distance. Barricades. Now, this is one of the things that not a lot of people know unless you've actually taken a class. And even then, I do these classes regularly, and some of the guys maybe have heard it, but don't remember it. What the standard says is stripes on barricade rails shall be alternating orange and white retroreflective stripes sloping downward at an angle of 45 degrees in the direction road users are to pass. So the standard says you read them from top to bottom. If the stripes are angled to the left, then you pass the barricade to the left. You drive to the left side of it. If the stripes are angled to the right, then you pass to the right of it. And again, These are things that even some of the workers don't really know. So you'll see barricades set up every which way. Now, does it matter how you set them up if the public doesn't know? Yes, even then it matters, right? Because if, let's just say someone's texting and driving and they crash into your work truck, and then while someone's doing an investigation, they're taking pictures, they notice that the barricades are striped towards your truck. Now, that's an easy way for a lawyer to just say, well, my client just drove into your work truck because the barricade was telling them to drive to your work truck. And yes, I know it seems like a small thing, like how can someone get off on that? Well, people have gotten off on less than that before. So again, set them up the right way if you know how to set them up, right? And make sure that your employees are aware of it. Work timelines. Now, the longer you're out there, you can kind of say that how you're setting up is going to be a little bit different. Long-term stationary. Anything that's considered long-term, guys, you should have an engineered, designed traffic control plan. Okay, so anything long-term stationary, what's going to stay in place longer than 3 days, has to have that engineered plan. And usually when you're doing a long-term operation, you're not setting out cones. It means you're most likely you're going to be racing or taking out stripes on the roadway and restriping it, so you're providing a different path of travel, right? That way they're paying attention to the striping on the roadway. There's no conflict between the cones and what the striping is saying. So long-term stationary is a beast on its own. Intermediate term stationary occupies a location more than 1 daylight period, up to 3 days, or nighttime work lasting more than an hour. Short-term stationary, daylight work that occupies a location for more than 1 hour within a single daylight period, so more than 1 hour up to a day. You've got short duration, is work that occupies a location for up to an hour, and mobile work that's moving intermittently or continuously. Now, of course, the state's going to have guidelines on how these things have to be done or how you should be doing them, but that's exactly what they are, is guidelines. They're not strict, hey, this is what you have to do 100% of the time. So I'll have guys that'll say, hey, well, we're only going to be out here half an hour. Should we set up the cones? The guidelines don't necessarily say I have to. And then I'll let them know, yeah, well, the guidelines are exactly that. They're guidelines. The goal, again, in traffic control isn't to meet compliance. The goal is to make sure that these guys are getting to work each and every day and coming back home in the same condition they got to work. So the guidelines are just a guideline, but it should never be exactly what's followed. Your setup should be according to where you are working, right? Because it's different to set up in a center lane or in an intersection or wherever you're doing the work. You have to base it on what hazards you are exposed to. Your goal is to meet safety, guys, to be safe, right? If you feel safe on the roadway, if you've got what you need to have out there to feel safe, then compliance just comes along with it, right? Worry about safety and not compliance. If your guys are safe, you don't have to worry about compliance. Mobile operations. Mobile operations shall have appropriate devices on the equipment or shall use a separate vehicle with the appropriate warning devices. So basically your striping machines or the trucks, the patching trucks that you're using have to have those lights to have people go around your truck or that to know, to stay back, right? And if your vehicles don't have the appropriate lighting, they have to have a shadow vehicle following that vehicle, the one doing the mobile work, right? So mobile vehicle has to have the lighting, or a shadow vehicle, a vehicle that's trailing it, has to have the appropriate lighting. Flagging. And again, I know we're running short on time, guys. I'm trying to give you guys as much information as I can before we run out of time. Now, if you guys notice here, and this is done intentionally, okay? If you've done a class before, you'll see that 2 of these signs on this slide are switched. If you haven't caught it by now, the ones that are not correct would be to let traffic proceed and to alert and slow traffic. Those 2 signs or 2 hand signals should be swapped. So the description on those 2 aren't matching their description or the picture. All right, so swap those, draw a line through them on your papers that you print out eventually. Make sure that you guys understand that. we use that kind of catch people off guard, and it's kind of like those activities you did in those coloring books growing up, where you draw a line to the correct picture. Okay. Now, again, there are certain requirements for the flaggers. All flaggers have to be trained. All flaggers have to know how to move and guide people safely through these work sites. So yes, the state says they have to be trained, and the training has to be based on the manual, because I've been through different work sites and I've done, recommendations for cities, because I'm out there with these guys doing the work, and I'll see that sometimes guys get creative on their hand signals. So they'll make a fist, like an equipment operator. Sometimes you'll see that they say stop by closing their hand, making a fist. Yes, an equipment operator will know that that means stop, but again, not everybody driving past your site understand that that's a stop sign, right? So you want those hand signals to be consistent with the ones mentioned in the manual, which are the stop, proceed, and slow down. And again, these guys have to be trained before being on the site, before working on the roadways. And training isn't, hey, here's your stop, slow paddle, and now it's pretty easy, get on the site. That's not the way it works. Again, if these guys don't know how to do their job and guide traffic safely through the site, if they do something wrong, everybody involved, especially the person who told them to be the flagger, can be held liable and responsible. Qualifications for flaggers: they have to have the ability to maneuver quickly to avoid danger. That means where you're placing these flaggers matters, right? If you have them right next to a wall where it'll be difficult to scale and climb, let's say if a vehicle was veering in their direction, they've got nowhere to run, right? So they have to have an easy escape. They should never be stationed on a traffic island in the center of the roadway, right? Because if the vehicle's heading towards them, all they could do is run into traffic. So where these flaggers are stationed matters. They must have the ability to control signaling devices to provide clear guidance. So after a while, you'll notice that people tend to forget what side the paddle's on. So at some point, you may drive past the site and see a guy saying stop with their hand signal, and then it'll show slow on the paddle. Again, these guys have to be effective. If they no longer know what side the paddle's on, it's probably time to give this guy a break, right? Because after a while, staring into traffic, guys, you start thinking about who's playing tonight. Did I pay that last bill? Did people get random thoughts for some reason. So pay attention to your flaggers and swap them out as necessary. They must have the ability to recognize dangerous situations. Why is it doing that? Dangerous situations and warn others. Remember, part of the flagger's responsibilities is to control traffic and also avoid the danger and let everybody behind them know that the danger is there. Right? So it's not just, oh, why is our flagger running away? This guy has to warn everybody else. His responsibility is to control traffic and warn everybody of the impending danger. So how you guys do that is going to also matter, right? Your signaling device is your warning device. I've seen people use whistles, which are a good tool. I've seen people use air horns, which is good as well if you use it for its intended purpose. I've seen people use try to communicate through cell phone communication, which is going to be bad, because what if one guy doesn't have any service, or let's say their cell phone dies, now we've got a problem, right? So what you're using to communicate these hazards matters. Whistles are great, unless you're like, say, you're flagging near an elementary school where everybody who's watching the kids tends to have a whistle. Now you won't be able to distinguish a warning sign or warning signal. Air horns, great. Not very many of them are out there. Not a lot of people use them. So it'll be easy to distinguish an air horn. But again, my time out there working and my time just in general doing inspections or being around the work crews, I see that sometimes they use these air horns to signal breaks as well. So let's say this danger happens when it's 5 minutes to lunch. You blow the horn, they're going to assume you're calling out lunchtime, so it's going to lose its effectiveness, right? And again, communication device is necessary, especially when one flagger can't see the other flagger or what's going on the opposite end of the work site. All right. Training of flaggers. Flaggers have to be trained on the equipment which must be used and how the station has to be laid out. This had signals, guys, how to tell traffic to stop, proceed, or slow down. How to control one side of traffic at the very least. Proper flagging methods and operations. what to do when dealing with emergency vehicles. And of course, there's not just one thing that may happen when you're dealing with emergency vehicles. You can have advanced warning, you hear the sirens at a distance, and you can have, let's say a police officer stuck in traffic and then having to respond to an emergency when they're close to your site. So there's different ways of handling those situations, handling various emergency situations, dealing with hostile drivers, which if you talk to your work crews, these guys are dealing with hostile drivers, it seems like every day out on the roadways. Single flagger procedures, and of course, just like anything else, guys, documentation is key. You have to have proof of training. You have to make sure that these guys understand what they're doing and not just, yeah, I sat through the 1 hour webinar or whatever you guys are, whatever is being done to train these guys. These guys, what I've mentioned in my classes, these classes aren't just about passing the test. These classes are about understanding the subject, right? And I let these guys know, hey, once you pass the test, if something happens, you're trained, you're certified, right? One thing you can no longer say is, well, I didn't know. So once you pass the test, you can't say that anymore. You want to make sure that these guys not only pass their test, but they understand what they're supposed to be doing out there on the roadway. All right, so in order to be safe as a flagger, guys, you have to be seen. You have to pay attention to what's coming towards you. There's a lot of accidents that happen where flaggers are struck because they take their eye off traffic, or they're paying attention to what the guys are doing instead of what's coming towards them. You guys know that not everybody stops for the flagger. If you guys ever get any of those warning signs, the red flags, that gut feeling that this guy is not going to do what he's supposed to do, then you're supposed to avoid that vehicle, right? You're not going to jump in the roadway and try to stop the car. You're car versus person, car always wins, all right? So flagger, what you're going to do is you're going to drop the paddle and run away from traffic. Again, flagger isn't just going to run away. He also has to warn the guys working behind them, right? Because if it can hurt the flagger, it can most definitely hurt the guys working behind him. So signal the work crew. Work crew, you get that signal. You're not stopping to pick up your lunch. You're not going to pick up your tools. You get that signal. You're supposed to see what's going on and run away, right? Never run into live traffic lanes. So here we're going to just kind of start clicking through, guys. We've got requirements for the vests. The requirements in the CAMUTCD say for daytime and nighttime, flaggers shall wear high visibility safety apparel that meets performance class 2 or 3. So the minimal requirements for daytime would be class 2, class 3. So if you notice, they write it in a particular way. Daytime, nighttime, class 2, class 3. The vests are these here shown here. The main differences are, guys, is the amount of reflective material, right? So class 3s will have the sleeves. It's kind of like a t-shirt instead of the vest. It's still considered a vest. The only difference is the sleeves with the added material. If you're flagging at night, anything other than emergencies, the site has to be illuminated. And here's the reason why. If you guys can see this guy, this flagger is wearing not only the vest, but he's wearing the reflective pants. And if remember, yeah, you're going to be able to see the reflective material at 1,000 feet, but with no lighting, that reflective material to me looks like a cone. So you can't tell the flagger from a cone. And that means people aren't going to be able to follow your instruction. How you're setting up the lights matter as well, the lighting. It always has to be set up so the people driving by can see you, so you can see what you're doing, right? So it should never be aimed towards traffic. It should be aimed towards the work site. All right. All signs, stop slow paddle minimum dimensions, 18 and 6. 18 by 18 with 6-inch letters. Now, those are pretty rare. You'll constantly find the 24-inch paddles. 24-inch paddles are basically what the standards are saying is that you should be using them for speeds 30 mile per hour or greater. Height requirements, if you're using the staff, it's got to be a 6-foot staff. Short handle, the handle has to be 12 inches. Here are your communication devices. We kind of discussed those, so I'm just going to go right through. And I know we're running short on time, guys. Make sure that you work well prepared. And obviously, this is going to be depending on the climate or the area that you're working. Extra clothing in case of weather change. Here in California, in the wintertime, you may deal with cold weather. And here in California, you may be dealing with 2 hours of cold weather in the beginning of the day. And if all you're taking is the jackets, which are nice, those nice jackets with reflective material, if you're just carrying those things out, you're only going to wear them maybe for an hour. All right, so if you have the jackets, make sure you have your vest with you in your work trucks as well. This one here is going to be specific to California so far, right? It's the heat on a standard. This one is triggered in California for 80 degrees. 80 degrees, employer shall provide 1 quart of water per employee per hour for drinking the entire shift, right? Which is, again, a topic all on its own. That's just a thing that the state will say, all right? You have to have it. Flag ergonomics, these guys are out there. They appreciate comforts. Something you learn early on is you take care of your feet, all right? What you pay for your shoes matters. When I first started in construction, I made the mistake of, going into construction with no money whatsoever. So I found the cheapest pair of boots. I learned quickly that you don't buy the cheapest pair of boots. So I spent my first check on nice, comfortable boots, right? Standing mats, again, ergonomic mats help. Makes the job easier for these guys. Not a necessity, it just, helps. Staggered duty. Now that one I do say has to be done, right? Because again, if the flagger is ineffective, someone has to step in for them, right? Staggered duty. So again, flagger procedures, they have to know how to alert traffic and tell them to slow down. They have to tell them effectively, they have to give them the correct hand signals to stop, proceed, slow down. And emergency flagging has its own set of flagging hand signals as well. All right, so here we've got the hand signal for stop, right? Stop paddle facing the public, travel, people traveling on the roadway. Hand out, telling them to stop. Pretty easy. Proceeds, slow sign, and you're guiding them, you're waving them by. And how you're delivering these signs matter as well, right? Because if you're doing it at a quick pace, and let's say you held them up for 5 minutes, you're waving them by really fast, they're going to assume that you're telling them to floor it through the site, right? So again, calm, slow hand signals, right? Don't let your hand signals be misunderstood. And then we've also got emergency flagging requirements, guys. The flags, these here shown in California, are only allowed to be used for emergency situations. And what the guidelines say is if you have the paddle and the flag, it's still better to use the paddle, even for emergencies, because it's easier to understand what you want them to do. It's easier for the public to understand what you want them to do with the paddle than the flag, right? So here are the requirements for these flags. The hand signals are pretty consistent. Stop is still stop. Flag in the roadway like that. Hand signal, palm facing, the public. Proceed, you drop the flag hand down and you wave them by just like you would with the stop slow paddle. The one that changes is to alert and slow traffic. So this one, your free hand drops down, and this is the only time you're going to be waving the flag up and down or in any way. If you ever have seen people try to emergency flag, sometimes you see them waving cars by like a NASCAR. That's not how it's supposed to be used. The only waving is up and down, and that's to tell people, hey, watch out, there's a hazard ahead. Slow down, right? That's it. Now, I mentioned emergency vehicles, okay? With advance warning, that means you hear the sirens at a distance. You have to treat it as if that emergency vehicle has to travel through your work site. So you hear the sirens, what you're supposed to do is stop traffic in all directions until you no longer hear the siren. So either they've gone through your site or they've taken a different route, right? You stop traffic, and then once the sirens are gone or the emergency vehicle has passed, then you can allow traffic to flow again. Whoever last moved is, it's going to be the opposite end that goes through. With no advance warning. So as you guys know, not every emergency vehicle has its lights and sirens going at every time, right? So sometimes they'll be going maybe back to their yard or wherever they're going, the hospital, and they're not dealing with an emergency, so they'll be traveling like anybody else. And let's say they have to respond to an emergency while they're stuck and you're at your flagging station. Now, just because they kicked on the sirens doesn't mean that it's going to be safe for them to go through that flagging station, right? If we've stopped traffic on this end, that normally means that the other end's flowing. So what you're supposed to do is stop the emergency vehicle, communicate with the other flagger and tell him to stop traffic and move all equipment out of the roadway. And then once you've verified with the other flagger that the roadway is clear, then you allow the emergency vehicle to pass. And again, this isn't what we say. This is what the CAMUTCD says. So this is something that police officers, EMTs, the fire department should be aware of as well. Dealing with drivers isn't fun. Throw that out there now. Being one of those drivers, it probably isn't fun to deal with as well. You have to understand, guys, that sometimes it's not the public just trying to be a burden or a hassle or anything like that. What it is that sometimes you're dealing with a person like me. I go to usually 5 different locations a week to do some type of a training or some type of consulting, right? Sometimes GPS just happens to take you through those locations that are the road closed or the heavy traffic or whatever it may be. And when those roads are closed, I mean, they may stop and ask for directions. And there's nothing illegal about that, guys. All right. So what you guys can do, especially when you're dealing with the public, the way you handle the public matters. Be an informed flagger. If it's those situations, know your way around your work area. Because sometimes you're only closing a small stretch of the roadway, right? So you can say, hey, well, if you make a left back at the street, you make a right, you end up at the same place, right? Give effective directions. Smile at an angry motorist or pedestrian. Now, that doesn't mean you smirk at the guy that's stuck in traffic because he's angry and you know that you're holding him up. What you're supposed to do is kind of like smile like you normally would with anybody else, right? Good morning, that kind of thing. Your job isn't really to interact with the public. It's to safely guide them through the site. You want to agree with angry motorists or pedestrians. Now, that doesn't mean, hey, they're cursing you out, they're calling you idiots or whatever. You guys have all heard it before. It's not yes sir, I am. It's what it means is don't disagree, don't argue with the public, right? Because what normally happens, guys, if you're arguing with the public, all you can do is lose. All it's going to do is lead to an altercation. They may not have anything to lose, and yeah, you guys definitely have lots to lose there. Now, avoid the conflict, right? I'm not saying don't defend yourselves, guys. That's never what I'm going to say out there. But there is differences between defending yourself and becoming that aggressor. Don't become the aggressor. Avoid extended eye contact, and that just depends on the context of it as well, because you guys have all been there where you make eye contact or where someone makes eye contact for way too long and it feels uncomfortable. That could lead to sexual harassment. Or if you've ever, I don't know why this has become the case, but guys in particular, you look at a guy for too long and it becomes that macho test. Let's see who looks away first, right? So it leads to some type of a conflict. Avoid it. You guys understand how long is comfortable eye contact, right? Avoid being that guy that, all right, yeah, put that the machismo out there and, yeah, I'm going to take this guy down. I'm going to throw a punch. Nowadays, there aren't very many fair fights out there, guys. You may go out there to try to throw a punch. So what I usually recommend is if this person's, threatening violence, that's your cue to walk away. That's your cue to get law enforcement involved. You don't have to stay there and be part of that violence. And you got your work crew behind you. Just avoid it. Just walk back to them and let them know what the situation is. That doesn't mean you guys now all rush the guy. It just means just watch out, right? Because nowadays, I mean, you often hear of freeway shootings. So that means that you may go out to throw a punch, someone may be reaching under the seat, right? So don't be that guy. Don't be the aggressor. Don't make it more than it has to be. Be courteous and be professional. Remember that when you're on that roadway, you're not just representing yourself. You're representing your city, your company, whoever's paying you to get that job done. And people, yes, you guys do hundreds of thousands of good things for the public. But what people tend to remember and what employers tend to remember is not the thousands of good things you do. They tend to remember that one time you screwed up. All right. So try to keep those to a minimum, guys. Be professional out there. You always have eyes on you.